Welcome back to Green is Good. This is the Go Green edition of Green is Good. We're here in beautiful downtown Seattle, and we're so honored to have with us today AP Hurd. She's the President and Chief Development Officer and author of Touchstone, and we're just so happy to have you here today. We're going to talk about Touchstone, we're going to talk about AP Hurd, and we're going to talk about your book.
Excellent.
Before we get on this journey together today, AP, talk a little bit about your story and how you got interested in sustainability and being green, and how did you even get to this place and where you are today in your life?
It's a good question. I think I was always somewhat interested in sustainability, but maybe didn't always understand the role that business could play in supporting sustainability goals. And when I left grad school, I had the good fortune to work for a very innovative company in the Northwest called McKinstry, which is a big mechanical contractor and energy services retrofit provider.
Okay.
And very charismatic, innovative CEO called Dean Allen, who I worked for and started up a couple different business units in the company, and really realized that there was tremendous power in the private sector if you could harness that power to both make money and drive environmental change, that there was a really strong leverage point there.
Did you grow up in Seattle area?
No, I grew up in Ottawa, in Canada.
In Ottawa?
Yeah.
Was your family into green when you were growing up, or is Canada mostly is green anyway, so you got some of that as a kid?
We have a lot of nature compared to the number of people. I would say, Canadians maybe are generally maybe a little bit more environmentally focused in some ways, though
okay.
You can't really generalize because
okay.
There's lots of different groups in both Canada and the US. I would say maybe, one of the major differences on the environmental front is that Americans feel it's really their government's duty to build as many roads as they can possibly use. And Canadians, while Americans often regard us as socialists, we have that sentiment to a much lesser extent.
Gotcha. That's a great way of putting it. So when in this journey did you start Touchstone?
So I moved to Touchstone about 9 years ago now.
Okay.
And I really liked working at McKinstry. It's a great company doing some really innovative things. But one of the things that I realized is the higher up you move in the supply chain, the more you can impact change, right? It's always easier to impact your suppliers than to impact your customers. And if you're closer to the top end of the supply chain, you got more people that you can shift. And so, in terms of buildings, when I was working as a mechanical contractor, a lot of times we're trying to use the mechanical systems of buildings to fix other problems, like the building wasn't oriented the right way, or it didn't have an energy efficient skin on it, or it wasn't even in a place that somebody should have built the building in the first place. And so you're limited about the box of what you can solve. Whereas when you move upstream to being a developer, you get to pick a good place to put the building, you get to orient it the right way, and then you get to put the right mechanical system in.
Oh, that's so interesting. So Touchstone is a redevelopment company?
We're a development company, so we do mostly ground up development, and we really focus on office and hotel and a little bit of residential, and we really do projects in urban transit-oriented areas, so always near transit. A lot of our sites are also, it happens, brownfield sites, so they're sites that were contaminated in the 40s or 50s or 60s before environmental regulations were really in place the way they are today. And so a lot of times, not only are we building a sustainable building in a sustainable location, but we're cleaning up the ground under the building in the process.
That's so interesting. And for our listeners and our viewers out there that want to learn more about AP Hurd's company, Touchstone, go to www.touchstonenw.com. So, how many years you've been there now?
Just about 10 years.
And you're the President and Chief Development Officer.
Yes.
So, how is that going? And do you feel now that you've gone upstream, are you able to make a bigger impact on the communities where you're making your real estate developments?
So that's a great question. It's obviously going well now because we're at a really good point in the real estate cycle nationally. I would say 5 years ago it was really challenging because after the kind of downturn, the sort of new building construction really came to a standstill. And, it's always hard for companies in cyclical industries to pull through. We're building about 1.5 million square feet of office and hotel in Seattle right now. So quite a lot of development, about 6 or 7 projects. And it's nice to see that vision that you have to put in place for years kind of come to fruition. I would say in terms of how much we're able to impact the industry, Seattle is a very sustainably focused city. The general contractors and the supply chains we work with do a lot to divert materials from, landfill. The architects we work with are really tuned into how to design sustainable buildings. There's a lot of things we can do in Seattle that don't have a cost premium associated with them because everybody's doing them. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So in the early 1990s, if you wanted to have a low flush toilet, in your building, you had to order the low flush toilets from Germany. So you had to find someone who spoke German, and you had to call them on the phone in German, and then you had to have the toilets delivered in a container, and maybe they got there, and maybe one of them was broken, and so then it's very complicated, right? High barriers to getting a low flush toilet. But nowadays, everything in Seattle is a low flush toilet. You can't buy a toilet that uses a lot of water anymore. So there's some really nice things about working in this area because everyone's oriented to doing things in a more sustainable way. I think maybe one of the biggest challenge is, it's harder to shift your customers because really they're always right. And also, we have some challenges in Seattle because land use is a very important component of sustainable buildings, and we've had a lot of growth in the city over the last few years. And so there's a sort of tension in the city around wanting to put growth in transit-connected, close-in areas, which is obviously good for the environment, but also some people feeling like their neighborhoods are changing too quickly. And so one of the biggest sustainability challenges we have as a region is kind of embracing growth and realizing that it presents an opportunity to do more of the right thing rather than sort of giving in to the discomfort that change always causes and sort of saying like, oh no, we don't want any more of this, when really we're riding a very good thing in Seattle right now.
Talk a little bit about Seattle. I mean, are you only doing developments at Touchstone in Seattle right now?
So we're a local company. We're a 30-year-old company. And we have really focused on Seattle because one of the things that is common to places like Seattle and San Francisco and LA and Boston and New York is that there's a lot of regulation involved in doing development. And so both, around land use and buildings and, environmental regulations at the state level. And the more you understand that and the more you can kind of negotiate with people to make projects happen and, use relationships to figure out how to get things done, that's really a big competitive advantage of ours. I think the converse of that, which is really exciting, is we're really committed to place. We've been here 30 years. We're going to be around for a heck of a long time more, hopefully. And we're really thoughtful about how to make the region work economically and environmentally for the next 30 to 60 years, or maybe even the next 100 years. And so we really engage in policy a lot, not in the way you might imagine the private sector would engage of just like, no, don't regulate us, but more kind of engaging in realizing that the city's goals and the region's goals are also our goals, and we just have to figure out how to get there in a way that meets the goals and also works for the private sector and helps leverage the power of the private sector to get there even faster.
AP, do the buildings that you build, if I lived in one of your Touchstone buildings, are they all LEED certified, platinum certified, or gold certified?
So we primarily do office buildings, so we don't have a lot of residential, but the LEED program has a lot of different types of designations for different types of buildings. So as an example, in our office buildings, we typically do LEED silver, but often LEED gold, core and shell. And we actually worked with the U.S. Green Building Council about 15 years ago to develop the pilot shell and core designation. Wow. So that's another place where, the way that LEED was being structured around the building and the tenant improvements, that wasn't how we delivered our buildings in the city. And so instead of just saying like, no, this doesn't work for us, we actually partnered with the U.S. Green Building Council and tried to figure out how do we do a path so all the other people who do business like we do can also have a way to participate in this effort and really build scale.
Wow, and for our listeners and our audience members that just joined us, we've got AP Hurd. She's the President and Chief Development Officer of Touchstone. You can learn more about Touchstone at www.touchstonenw.com. She's also an author. AP, why did you come to Go Green today? This is the Go Green edition of Green is Good. Talk a little bit about your involvement with Go Green and why you feel it's important to be here today.
Well, I was on the panel this morning that was looking at businesses that really support the climate declaration, which is related to improving regulation, but also putting a price on carbon and a price on carbon pollution specifically.
Okay.
And so there were 4 businesses that participated in that panel that have been really supportive of creating thresholds for carbon emissions and really creating a price so that we can push more people in the economy to think about these negative challenges that we have and drive the economic forces to address them.
So that's a perfect lead-in for our discussion about your book. You wrote a book called The Carbon Efficient City. Mm-hmm. When did you write that book?
I wrote that book about 5 years ago, and it was published about 3 years ago. Yeah.
And what inspired you to write that? I mean, you have listen, running any company, being the president of any company is a full-time job, as we both know. Why did you write this book, and why was that important for you to get this out there, and what's happened since then?
Well, full disclosure, I wasn't the president at the time.
Okay, well, still.
But I guess I would say, I think there's so many people that are working so hard to improve the environmental quality and specifically reduce climate change and reduce carbon emissions, but a lot of the efforts are very fragmented. So one person will do something over here and another person will do something over there, but people don't always understand how their efforts fit into the bigger picture. And because I've been so involved on the policy front, I was working with local government and state government and trying to work on these different policy levels, but it was almost like because carbon pollution is a newer problem, these institutions didn't have a tradition of how to work together to solve it and what was the appropriate level of agency for each of them to be operating at. And they also often weren't sure how to best tap into the innovation and investment of the private sector to really create new ideas and innovations. And so when I was in grad school, I went to grad school at MIT, and there's a lot of work that's been done at MIT around something called systems theory, which is the idea that things don't happen in a vacuum, they happen in ways that influence other things. And so systems theory is about how do a whole bunch of institutions or a whole bunch of cells in the human body work together to produce a result. And I think, carbon pollution and climate change is a systems problem. We didn't get to global warming by accident. We got there because we're a society that has extracted a lot of fossil fuels and burned them and created a lot of economic momentum around that, and we've never wrestled with the negative consequences of that and asked people to consider it as part of their economic decisions. We just haven't. We just say, you burn it, you're done.
Right.
And so I think what I was hoping to do with the book was create a middle ground that was not politicized about the right or the left, but that really provided a thoughtful role for all of our institutions to play, whether they're federal government or state government or local government or the private sector or academic institutions or nonprofits, that all of them are always going to act in their own self-interest, but there's also ways that we can shift the rules of the game a little bit to get a different outcome.
That's so great.
And so sort of this idea again, we didn't get here because there's no other way to play the game. That there's just a way that we all can support slightly different rules and get to a really different outcome, and no organization has to compromise what their mission is to get there.
How has your book been received, and what doors has it opened for you because you're now an author?
That's a really good question. I think one of the challenges about writing policy books instead of, say, cookbooks is that people don't give them away for Christmas. People give cookbooks for Christmas, they don't give away policy books for Christmas. So it's really hard to write a policy bestseller. Yeah. One of the great things was that my book was picked up by the University of Washington Press, which is a well-respected academic imprint, and so that sort of underwrote that I wasn't a total crank. And then I also think because I'm really involved kind of at the local and state level around these issues, it's been a really nice short form of sharing the ideas with other folks that are working on these things.
Wow.
So I would say kind of in the Northwest, it's been picked up more by legislators and policymakers and things like that. Because of my real day job around working in real estate, It's been harder to promote the book in other places, but I have gotten calls from people in Boston and people in Toronto and things like that, sort of asking how do we do this? And so that's been really nice to see it getting a little further reach.
Let's give it a shameless plug. Can people buy it on Amazon?
They can buy it on Amazon.com, yeah.
It's called The Carbon Efficient City, AP Hurd, The Carbon Efficient City. on Amazon.com. So you heard it here at Green is Good. AP, talk a little bit about the evolution. You wrote it 5 years ago. We've seen, since you wrote this book, Tesla come out. Driverless cars start being the beginning of the socialization of driverless cars, and the technology's there. What does this mean for the carbon efficient city in the future and in the years ahead of us?
That's a good question. I would say that there has been some great technological innovation, and I think your point about cars sort of underscores that really improvements in battery life have driven tremendous potential around how we use and share energy. The interesting thing is that those improvements around battery life were actually driven economically by the desire of people to have longer-lived portable devices, right? So I think it's a great illustrative example of the fact that customer delight and private sector innovation can really drive research and innovation that ultimately benefits the environment, right? And so I think there's been some really big wins in that respect. I would say that maybe one of the disappointments of the last few years has been a bit of a balkanization of the politics around implementing meaningful carbon pricing policy at the state or federal level. And that has been a big disappointment, particularly as we watch the problem getting more acute with extreme weather events or wildfires or things like that. Certainly in the Northwest, our water supply is our snowpack, and we don't have it. We're really, we're going to have a very dry summer. And so I'm hopeful that maybe that what the next 5 years can hold is enough people understanding, and I think the polling is starting to show this across the U.S., enough people understanding both that climate change and carbon pricing is a priority and that it does not need to come at the expense of economic growth. I think we have moved in the first direction, but I think there's a lot of people that feel like, oh, it's a trade-off between jobs and the environment. And I think now we're starting to move to people thinking that is no longer the case. And if we can get people there and we can vote for carbon pricing, then we will absolutely unleash a huge wave of innovation where tech investors, particularly VCs, are able to really seed companies and see a much clearer path towards ROI and profitability on the products that they're investing in.
That's so interesting. And also, we've moved, even just in the last 5 years, we've started the major paradigm shift from a linear economy to a shared economy. Therefore, the rise of Uber and Lyft and others also help, hopefully, reduce the carbon footprints in cities and things of that such.
One of the things that I think a lot of people haven't talked about with Uber and Lyft that I find fascinating is we have a lot of cities in the U.S. that have a very dispersed land use pattern because the bulk of the building was done in a period of high automobile growth and reliance. And as we try to shift those cities onto more transit networks, it's really tough because the city's so spread out, it makes it hard to have good high-frequency, high-capacity transit. So what you wind up with in a lot of cities, in Seattle is like that, is you have some corridors or nodes that really build up density to support the transit, but the transit often doesn't get you everywhere in the city, so it's not a total solution. It's like a 60% solution or an 80% solution, and I all the time hear people say like, oh yeah, I drive to work because like, what if I need to pick up my kid and they're sick at school in the middle of the day, or what if a meeting gets called at the last minute? And to me, the beauty of some of these solutions like Uber or a car to go is that they fill the gap in the transit system and allow people who wouldn't otherwise be transit riders to shift into being transit riders, because now they have a really good solution for when the transit doesn't meet their needs.
That is so interesting. Talk a little bit about density, though. You just brought up the word density. I had an urban planner on the show a year ago, and he had a theory on sustainability and density and the re-urbanization of our cities. He said, he was in my age group in his 50s, he said, our generation, John, grew up watching the Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family. The families had a little success, they moved way out into the suburbs with their big cars, and they buy big homes and fill them with stuff, and kept filling them up with more and more stuff. He says, our children have grown up with Friends and Seinfeld. And he goes, they see the right way to live is in cities and walk around, and city living is something that they wanted to aspire to. Are you seeing that as a real estate developer here in Seattle, the youth of America flocking back to urban centers? And is that good for your premise of building and making our cities more carbon efficient?
Yeah, so first of all, I do see the phenomenon that you're describing. There are some folks that have cast some doubt on whether the Xers and the millennials will really want to stay urban as they have kids. But I think the Xers are starting to prove out that people will stay urban. I think it's absolutely a good thing in terms of our development thesis as a company. And, if downtown Seattle, it's really interesting. We have about a 65% non-SOV commute rate. So what that means is for people who are commuting to jobs in downtown Seattle, 65% of them are not coming in a single occupancy vehicle. So they're coming by bus or by foot or by bike or in a carpool. And that is about almost 20 percentage points higher than it was 15 years ago.
That's awesome.
And so that is really exciting to see, but it's also a function of we have a radially oriented transit system where the center of it is downtown, and that's absolutely not true in terms of interconnecting neighborhoods and things like that. So if you were to look at some of our suburbs, they're not as connected by transit, and that makes it a real challenge. And so you have, in land use, you always have a chicken and egg problem. It's hard to put the transit in and make it pay for itself until you've got a lot of people moving there. But if a lot of people move there and you don't put transit, then the roads get all jammed up and you have traffic problems. So, it's almost like an iterative process to change your land use pattern, and trying to accelerate that in a world where, building buildings is slow.
Right.
It's something that we absolutely have to continue to work on.
I live in Manhattan now, and we have just recently seen the advent of the bike program. Mayor Bloomberg brought the bike program to New York, and Mayor de Blasio has continued to polish it and expand it. Is that same kind of bike program going on in Seattle here?
Do you mean like a bike share?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a bike share program called Pronto that just started a few months ago. It debuted in October, which is, sort of the start of our rainy season here. So it's been hard to sort of measure how much it's taking off.
Right.
A lot of times I think those things work very well, particularly in tourist areas. Whereas most people who are regular bike commuters, at least in a place like Seattle, seem to ride their own bikes. One of the other incidentals in Seattle is we have a lot of hills. And so if you ride your own bike, you're going to ride like a light bike that is easy to get up and down the hills. And a lot of times those bikes that are part of a bike share program, they're a little more sturdy. And one other interesting thing about bike share is there's a very high correlation between the success of bike share and the non-requirement for helmets in a city, because people don't really like to share grubby helmets. And so there's this very sort of paradoxical trade-off between like the safety regulations versus the amount that a bike share program gets kind of latched onto by the population. And so, I think there's always, when we're trying to innovate, we find these sort of quirky trade-offs of like, whoa, which is more important, wearing helmets or having a successful bike share program? And obviously people are trying to innovate and figure out how to do both. But it is an interesting example of where different regulations can conflict with different goals.
AP, we have a lot of young people in our audience in the United States and around the world that want to now finish up their education and go become the next AP Hurd and change the world from the top down. What advice can you give to our audience members that are still in the beginning part of their journey, either prior to college or now coming out of college or grad school, that are looking to find their first landing point to climb the mountain, so to speak?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that seems really important to me is to not just go just for sustainability. Sustainability is a byproduct of other economic and social activity.
Great point.
So I think it's really important that people pick something that they're really excited about, whether it's a type of industry or a type of work environment they want to be in or a type of technology that they're excited about, and that they really get a basis in that. And then once you're sort of driving a P&L, like you're driving profit in your industry, then you can really think about how do we shift the way that we do that to be more sustainable. And the other thing I would say is it seems like there's been a lot of focus in the last few years on people getting STEM degrees, so science, technology, math, and engineering.
Yeah.
And there's certainly a lot of employment in those areas. But I would encourage people, and I'm someone who has 2 engineering degrees, but I also have an English literature degree, and I find that the ability to think in terms of humanities and to think critically and to think analog is equally important to sort of our humanness and our ability to look at problems. And we can't believe that we're a world that's just about sort of abstract technical solutions. We have to realize we're a world where at the end of the day, it's about people. And so people who can get an education that allows them to feel really, really comfortable in the soup of technology, whatever their technology is, but also to bring the humanness and not forget that and bring that to bear on solving problems, I think that's a really magical combination.
And we're going to leave it there today. And, you know, people ask me about this show all the time, and the show is only good because we have amazing people like you on the show, AP, and you are just really, truly inspiring for our listeners out there. Again, to find AP and her great company, Touchstone, go to www.touchstonenw.com or buy her book, The Carbon Efficient City, on Amazon.com. AP Hurd, you're an inspiring thought leader and truly living proof that green is good. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Cheers.